The second part of my presentation on the Daedalus Complex, a term that I've coined myself, will be devoted exclusively to a discussion and analysis of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Part 3, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have 3 parts or 4, we'll see. But after Hamlet, I'll be devoting a part of this discussion to T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and then eventually culminating with Fernando Pessoa's masterpiece, modernist masterpiece, The Book of Disquiet. Maybe just a few words before I launch into Hamlet about the subject itself of the Daedalus Complex, remembering then that, to be sure, it is an echo of Freud's Oedipus complex, and remembering that in both cases, let's say, because you may not remember, but in both cases, certainly you would remember with Freud, the Oedipus complex is in the form of a triangular configuration, so that you have the son who wants to commit incest with the mother and who must kill the father in order to achieve that goal. And Freud famously applies that. He calls it the Oedipus complex because he sees a legendary, a famous, and immortal representation of it in Sophocles' Oedipus, which he then applies as well to Shakespeare's Hamlet. I have another presentation. I did another video on which I've posted on YouTube called Keeping Open Secrets in Oedipus and Hamlet, which basically is a challenge to Freud's interpretation of the emotional effect that's produced by Sophocles' play and subsequently, centuries later, by Shakespeare's Hamlet. Just to remind you then that, or to tell you that in the case of the Daedalus complex, again, we have a triangular relationship, but it's not mother, father, son. Rather, it's the author, and what I call, it makes a very nice pattern, a very nice harmony. You have what I call the designing author, and whose intent on creating a work whose formal design, so you have the designing author creating a work whose formal design is as perfect as he can possibly make it, but in order to perfect the formal design of the work, he needs, in the form of the protagonist, he needs what I call a designated victim. So you have the triangle formed by designing, design, and designated. And the idea then, and by the way, it was inspired years ago. I don't mention it in the first part, but I should give credit to the American literary cultural critic Kenneth Burke, who somewhere, I don't have the reference at hand, but it really resonated with me, and I've never forgotten it, and it's inspired a good deal of my own work. He says that the motive of a writer is the perfecting of the work, but in order to perfect the work, he needs the perfect victim. And it was like, whoa, eureka. It had never occurred to me that the protagonist of a work can be thought of, or should be thought of, in a quite profound way, though a hidden way to be sure, should be thought of as the author's victim. Think of Oedipus as Sophocles' victim. Think of Hamlet as Shakespeare's victim, for example. So you have that. You have the idea of kind of the ambiguity between, or the covert relationship between the protagonist, who in a kind of hidden way that we reveal through analysis, the protagonist is the victim of the work. But the other thing, too, is to notice the curious ambiguity, the uncanny relationship, say, between the perfection of the work and the perfection of the protagonist victim. To think then of the way in which Jay Gatsby, for example, and what happens to Jay Gatsby makes of him the perfect victim in the perfect work, which is F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, and to think then of Gatsby as Fitzgerald's victim. The couple of things then, one of them was, in my discussion of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is where I began, the Daedalus Complex, then the illustration, as for Freud, the illustration of the Oedipus complex was Sophocles' Oedipus the King. For me, the illustration of the Daedalus complex is in, it's book 9, I believe it's book 9 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which Daedalus, I'm back and forth between a couple of classic works, in which Daedalus then fashions the wings with which he and Icarus escape from Crete. And as I point out then, there is the contrast there. The victim, to be sure, is Icarus himself in flying too close to the sun, falls to his death. And then in contrast to that, you have Daedalus again. Daedalus, who is, the Daedalus complex has not yet become as well known, as legendary a coinage as the Oedipus complex, but perhaps one day, centuries from now, maybe. Anyway, the Daedalus is not remembered for having fallen to his death in the sea, but rather, of course, he's remembered for having constructed the labyrinth, having constructed the wings as well, and in ancient Greece, to be sure, the name Daedalus was synonymous with the figure of the artist. The thing I didn't mention, though, and I'd like to now, is to point out to you that it's not only that Daedalus escapes the catastrophe that befalls Icarus, but that Ovid himself, and I could almost call this the Ovidian complex, though that would be even more obscure, and it doesn't rhyme, as Daedalus rhymes with Oedipus. But I find it quite fascinating to realize in the epilogue to Metamorphoses, what Ovid claims for himself is that because of this work that he's created, he's immortalized himself. And the image, which is something of a commonplace perhaps, but in a quite fascinating way, I think, the image that he uses to convey the idea of his having immortalized himself is that he flies up, as it were. He flies up not to the sun, not during the day, but at night, into the night sky, where he's going to be there and immortalized, as it were, among the constellations. As you know, all various, since time immemorial, prehistory, I guess, human beings have been giving names, have been seeing people up there in the Orion, Sagittarius, and all the rest of them, the Gemini twins. And Ovid imagines himself, and so I'm going to read. It's a very beautiful piece of work, I think. It's the epilogue. It's a really, really tiny piece of Metamorphoses, but it places that book 9, the story of Daedalus and Icarus, it places it in a kind of overarching context in which we realize that the tragedy that befalls, and actually befalls both Daedalus and Icarus, because it's not only that Icarus dies, but that Daedalus has to bury him. And I didn't mention it in part 1 of this presentation, which is on another video, but that in book 9, at the end, Ovid tells us that Daedalus cursed his craft as he's burying Icarus, the grief that he feels, the regret that he feels at possessing this artistic capacity, this talent, this genius, which has allowed him to violate the laws of nature. Ovid, quite the contrary, is thrilled, revels joyously in the great pleasure that he takes in the concluding lines of the Odyssey, in telling us not only that here we are reading his book hundreds of years, millennia later, but also that he's up there among the constellations in the night sky. So I'll read just a few lines of the epilogue. He says, "Now my work is done. No wrath of Jove, nor fire, nor sword, nor time, which would erode all things, has power to blot out this poem. Now, when it wills, the fatal day, which has only the body in its grasp, can only take my body, can end my years, however long or short their span. But with the better part of me, the work that I've created, but with the better part of me, I'll gain a place that's higher than the stars. My name indelible, eternal, will remain. And everywhere that Roman power has sway, in all domains the Latins gain, my lines will be on people's lips, and through all time, if poets' prophecies are ever right, my name and fame are sure. I shall have life." I'd forgotten that detail, by the way. It's not only that he's going up, he'll be up there with the constellations, but he's going to go beyond. What does he say? That part of me, a place that's higher than the stars. I mean, talk about hubris, talk about pride, talk about violating the laws of nature, which is the quote-unquote crime for which Daedalus and Icarus are punished. And then the wonderful irony that, of course, poor Daedalus wants to escape from Minos's empire, while Ovid is taking pleasure in the thought that the Roman Empire, the Latin, will be spoken everywhere for all eternity. Ad etam aeternam, we used to say a long, long time ago, that it would still be, that his work would still be read. Okay, moving on a little more quickly then, and to remember that in the Divine Comedy, the point that I made is that you have the contrast in the Inferno between the Ulysses, this was in Canto 26, Ulysses' duplicitous or evil, seductive use of eloquence to draw his men to their damnation, which has the consequence of leading them. It's not what he intended, but it was the outcome. And then in contrast to that, you have Dante's use of his eloquence, and the eloquence of the spoken language, of the vernacular. Remember, he wrote a famous essay on the eloquence, whatever it is, I'm forgetting for the moment, but on the value then of Italian rather than Latin as a literary language. So he writes his poem in Italian, and a poem that's intended to bring all of humanity to a condition of joy, of glory, union with the Creator himself. And the other thing I didn't mention is just to remember that Inferno is only one of the three books of the Divine Comedy. You have Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, and eventually then that the journey that he takes, partly under the guidance of Virgil, but always under the inspiration from the very beginning of Beatrice, that Beatrice then takes over in the later books of Purgatorio and guides Dante into Paradiso, where eventually he has the culminating, the vision, the reunion with God himself, with the first mover, the unmoved mover. You may remember, if you read that far in the Divine Comedy. So there's a very nice parallel between the end, the conclusion, that the immortal goal that Ovid envisions himself as achieving, and now in a Christian framework, a similar goal conclusion that Dante imagines. Okay, turning now to Shakespeare's Hamlet, the most prominent form of suffering, and maybe I should pause for a moment, and what I mean is to notice again that we say the most prominent form of victimage, as it were, that would make clearer transition from what I've said in the previous parts of the presentation. The most prominent form of victimage that we notice is the unmanly grief of which Claudius accuses Hamlet, and which leads Hamlet to contemplate suicide in his first soliloquy. That Shakespeare may have transferred his own personal grief over the loss of his son Hamlet to Hamlet, who mourns that idea of a kind of victimage, Shakespeare feeling himself to be the victim of the untimely death, to be sure, of his son Hamlet, who mourns the death of his father. Shakespeare then mourning the death of his father is a commonplace of criticism of his most famous play. More recently, Stephen Greenblatt has speculated that Shakespeare may also have been haunted by conversations with his father, who, although still living, feared that he would die without benefit of a proper Catholic funeral, a ceremony that had recently been banned in England. In his introduction to the Oxford World Classics edition of the play, G.R. Hibbard adds further evidence in support of this view when he points to the similarities between Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy and Sonnet 66, which leads us to suspect that indeed there is an analogy, a proximity between Hamlet's grief, a mirroring relationship between Hamlet's grief and Shakespeare's. I just want to say real quickly, I realize that I'm going to talk about Hibbard again because there are a number of things that he says in his edition of the play that have had a very strong influence on my own understanding of Hamlet. And I talk about him at a certain length, at least, in the other video that I did, called, the title of which is Keeping Open Secrets in Oedipus and Hamlet. So I'm going to be kind of covering some of the same ground, but also developing it in a somewhat different way. In a remark that will recall T.S. Eliot's distinction between suffering and creativity, so I mentioned that in the first part of my presentation on the Daedalus Complex, which Eliot says calls attention to the distinction between the man who suffers and the mind which creates. Creativity is distinct. Eliot says you have the event on the one hand of suffering, but then you have art on the other hand, and the distinction between event and art, that's in Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, the distinction between event and art is absolute. Okay, in a remark that will recall Eliot's distinction between suffering and creativity, however, Hibbard later calls attention to an important difference between Shakespeare and his most famous dramatic character, of course, Hamlet. And this is Hibbard, then, a quotation. He says, Hamlet may question whether life is worth living and reject love because it leads only to the breeding of sinners. But the play in which he does this bears eloquent witness to its author's, to Shakespeare's then, to his author's fertility of invention, and to his exuberant delight in the sheer variety of human nature. Hibbert further implies an intriguing application of Eliot's distinction between, on the one hand, the man who suffers, and on the other, the mind which creates, as well as between event and art, when he speculates that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet under the thrall of what he calls a daemon. This is a quotation. The very length of the tragedy, even in the folio version, almost invites one to speculate that Shakespeare composed it at the compulsive urging of his daemon for his own satisfaction. It is almost as though the creative impulse refuses for once to heed the practical limitations and demands of the theater. In the very process of bringing his play to an end, Shakespeare expands its reach and significance. He cannot let go of it, and it will not let go of him. It's a very, very resonant formula, I think. Unlike the atmosphere of the play, in which corruption, the play itself then, in which corruption, decay, and death hold unmitting sway, there is in the play itself, as Hibbert observes, and I'm quoting him again, a sense of adventure about it all. It conveys the same feeling of excitement at moving into the unknown and the unexplored that Keats experienced in his poem On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Very, very beautiful poem, which many of you will know, or you will know. Hibbert's evocation of Shakespeare's own personal daemon, that creative impulse that won't let go of him, and the indifference to practical considerations that he induces in him, the daemon induces in him, should remind us of Horatio's warning to Hamlet as he goes to his meeting with a very different kind of daemon, or demon, in the form of what may be his father's ghost. We never know whether it is the ghost or not, whether it is the ghost of his father or a demon in the guise of his father. Horatio says to Hamlet, "What if it tempt you toward the flood, my lord, or the dreadful summit of the cliff that beetles o'er the base of the sea, and there assume some other horrible form which might deprive you of your sovereign reason and draw you into madness?" Horatio's warning to Hamlet regarding the perils of demonic possession and Hibbert's suggestion that Shakespeare may have been in the grip of a creative daemon of his own reminds us, as with technical skill and as with the technical skill of the Daedalus story and eloquence in Inferno 26, of the two diametrically opposing outcomes to which the same predicament can lead, depending on whether it befalls the man who suffers or the mind which creates. So the technical skill that Daedalus possesses in Metamorphoses is transformed into the literary skill that Ovid possesses and that immortalizes him, as also the eloquence that Dante attributes, at least to Ulysses, is then transformed into Dante's own salvific, as it were, salvific eloquence. The distinction between these two outcomes may be observed in Hamlet's first soliloquy. That's not the to be or not to be, but that this too solid flesh would melt. A soliloquy in which Shakespeare calls upon his considerable poetic skill to transmute Hamlet's paralyzing experience of grief. He wants to kill himself even before the to be or not to be soliloquy, even before he finds out that his father maybe does find out, to be sure, as we eventually understand that, yes, his uncle did kill his father. So he takes the, Shakespeare uses his poetic skill then to transform the paralyzing grief that Hamlet experiences into a pattern, the soliloquy itself, into a pattern that produces an effect of aesthetic stasis. I don't think I'll go through it now, do I? No, I don't. It'll take too much time. But if you get your copy of Hamlet out and look at the soliloquy that begins, the first of them, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt," you'll see it's in the form of a chiasm, so that the first line is repeated in the last, not precisely, it's echoed. The last line echoes the first. So, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt." And the last line is, "But break my heart," something like that. So you have the flesh that's melting and the heart that's at the beginning, the heart that's breaking at the end. And it goes the second line, the next to the last line, third line, the next to the last line, until we get to the very middle. And I think it's in the middle then that he refers to his father, to the king. And that's what I mean then by the effect of aesthetic stasis. So you have Hamlet is paralyzed, as it were, doesn't know what to do. And it's repeated, to be sure, in the to be or not to be soliloquy, the indecisiveness, paralysis again, but the relation between his paralysis and the static effect which is created by the design of the soliloquy, in which the second part, after you make a turn in the middle, the second part repeats the first part line by line. Hamlet's own personal demon or daemon has already confined him, even before the meeting with his father, or the meeting with the ghost, within a tormenting psychological labyrinth from which he can find no escape. Every line in his soliloquy points to a conflict that leads to an impasse. His desire to kill himself is prohibited by, quote, "the canon against self-slaughter." He cannot enjoy the pleasures of life because of his despairing perspective. The kingdom itself has become an unweeded garden. Hyperbole is once again at work when he contrasts Hyperion to a satyr. So again, it's like a mirroring relationship between his father, Hyperion, and that satyr, which is his uncle Claudius. His mother's absolute fidelity to her first husband, she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on, now has swung in the direction of absolute betrayal. So the mirroring relationship then again between fidelity and betrayal. And going on from there, I'm going to skip over some of this. Shakespeare's daemon, in contrast to Hamlet's, has inspired him to find in the successive impasses to which Hamlet has been led by his despair, has found in this his own creative occasion, one in which the same words that portend irresolvable conflict for Hamlet are arranged in such a way as to create a chiasm that effectively transmutes conflict into complementarity. I want to maybe underline that for a moment. You have throughout the play that all these face-to-face conflicts, but then you have two, and I use the word complementarity. Maybe it would be even better to use the word confluence, because there you have conflict in the face-to-face between characters, but then you have a sort of a very harmonious kind of confluence between the various episodes, the paired, the matching words, lines, episodes, as we'll see of the play. I see some of this is analysis of that soliloquy, and I'm going to skip it. By the way, I mean, if any of you are ever interested in further elaborations or further on, in part 3, I'll have some things to say about very precise things to say about the design of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And even as I think of it, I made years ago, because I really enjoy this sort of thing, I made a very detailed outline of the chiastic design of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And if any of you are interested in seeing this, just contact me in any way you want. I'm on Facebook, Tom Cousineau, and you can just write to me, and whether you befriend me or not, I'll send you a copy of some of these schemas, diagrams that I have, and that you may find as interesting as I do. Okay. What I will do this, is to talk about the chapel scene in Hamlet, because, and I'll say in a kind of prefatory way, that as some of you may know, if you've studied Hamlet before, if you've done any research, or attended lectures on the play or read up, there's Freud's interpretation, for better or worse, and I would say myself for worse, of Shakespeare's play, also of Sophocles' Oedipus the King, has had the effect of placing excessive, I would say, lopsided and very misleading emphasis on the so-called bedroom scene when Hamlet goes to his mother after the play, within the play, when he goes and he has this very, very intense back and forth scene with his mother. And in some directors, to be sure, attempted to present it, to stage it in a very erotic way. As some of you may know, and if you don't, it's interesting to see, to just go on YouTube, Hamlet, Laurence Olivier, who played Hamlet, was it back in the 1930s, when it was a long, long time ago, in any event. And at the very beginning, I guess that there's a voiceover, and you see the marriage bed, I suppose we could say, in the distance. You see the bed, and the voiceover is telling you, and I haven't seen it for a while, so I'm quoting approximately, Hamlet, a play about a man who loved his mother too much. I hope I'm not being facetious in saying that it seems to me that is certainly the idea, that you're supposed to understand that it's his Oedipal, his unresolved Oedipus complex that's at work, and that causes his paralysis, his hesitation. That's the Freudian explanation. And in my own view, then, what I find fascinating is the way in which, with the idea of the Daedalus Complex, the way in which Shakespeare takes the predicament of paralysis, of an inability to act, and what he does with it, which is certainly a problem for Hamlet, that he uses it as a creative occasion, and in the most general way, and it's something that is generally not noticed. I think I do talk about it in my Keeping Open Secrets. The way in which Shakespeare, in the second part of the play, mirrors Hamlet's indecision, so that in a way that in the first part of the play, Hamlet his paralysis prevents him from performing an act of revenge. In the second part of the play, after the play, within the play, which is right in the middle, and which is performed twice, is mirrored, or two mirroring performances. In the second part of the play, it's Claudius who's indecisive and who fails to act in self-defense by dealing with Hamlet until he eventually does. I do talk about that a bit in the Keeping Open Secrets video, so I don't want to go on about it too much. But what I'd like you to see is the way in which the play itself is organized by, say, this face-to-face between two forms of indecisiveness, two forms of inaction. And then that mirroring relationship that Shakespeare uses to construct the entirety of the play also appears in a miniature form, as it were, in the chapel scene, not so much in the bedroom scene. So I shift attention from the Oedipus complex in the bedroom to the Daedalus complex in the chapel, where both Hamlet and Claudius are unable to act. Claudius, remember, I'll read a couple of details. Claudius is unable to repent, is unable to give up what he's gained by having killed his brother. So he's not able to repent. And Hamlet, mirroring his uncle's inability to act, is unable to kill Claudius and to avenge his father's death in that way. So a very, very, very masterful and a very masterful demonstration of Shakespeare's art, and a very interesting, to my mind, and I hope also to yours, a very interesting example of the way in which the man, or now here it is, the men who suffer, that both Claudius and Hamlet suffer, and their suffering is, again, the occasion that Shakespeare uses for quite an impressive display of his own daemon. I mean, let's use the word daemon again, so that you have, in both with Claudius and Hamlet, they're both in the grip of a daemon, and Hamlet, Shakespeare himself is also in the grip of a daemon that won't let go of him until he really, really perfects that chapel scene. So let's see the perfection the perfection then that he achieves in that scene. I'll get back to my prepared remarks. So a similar transmutation of paralysis into aesthetic stasis may be observed in the so-called chapel scene, in which Shakespeare creates a diptych out of Claudius and Hamlet's parallel inability to perform an act that each so ardently desires. Claudius wants to repent having killed his brother, but is not ready to relinquish the rewards. And here's Claudius. My fault is past, but oh, what form of prayer can serve my turn? Forgive me my foul murder. That cannot be, since I am still possessed of those effects for which I did the murder. There are three things he's gained: my crown, my own ambition, and my queen. He is not giving up Gertrude. No way. Hamlet, for his part, wants to revenge his father's murder, but also to assure that Claudius will be damned. But he realized Claudius is there praying, and he's going to go to heaven as I kill him. He says, and am I then revenged to take him in the purging of his soul at the moment where he's confessing and being absolved of his fault, when he is fit and season for his passage? No, no, up sword, and know thou a more horrid bent. In other words, wait until he's doing something really bad and kill him at that point, which he does in a way, because he kills him at the very end of the play, right at the moment that Claudius is doing all these horrible things, he's arranging for the death of Hamlet, which of course has the result of killing everyone who's there except Horatio. The aesthetic stasis that Shakespeare creates here by transmuting the paralysis of his characters into a diptych is further reinforced by the mirroring relationship between the beginnings and ends of the two soliloquies that he writes for them. Claudius's begins, "Oh, my offense is rank, it smells to heaven," and ends, "Words without thoughts never to heaven go." So remember, it's a bit like Hamlet's, "Oh, this too solid flesh," that begins with the flesh melting and the heart breaking. Hamlet's begins, "Now might I do it, Pat. Now is a praying, and now I'll do it." And so it goes to heaven. Heaven then returns towards the end of his soliloquy in the line that his heels may kick at heaven. I won't kill him now, but well, if I did, he would indeed go to heaven. The transformation of paralysis into stasis that we observe in Hamlet's soliloquy, that this too solid flesh would melt, as well as in the chapel scene, also applies to the play as a whole, in which the proliferation of obstacles creates a series of actions that, failing to achieve the desired end, produce an effect of incoherence and disarray, as is memorably summarized by Horatio, who tells Fortinbras that the carnage that he observes is the result, and it's suggesting then the idea of it's something that happened, that there were just these one coincidence piled on another. He says the result of carnage, bloody and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and in this upshot purposes mistook. So people end up, the results were not by any means what they intended. And in this upshot purposes mistook, fallen on the inventors' heads. The inventors, it's an ambiguous term, because the inventors appear to be, who decided that Claudius would kill his brother and so on? Hey, well, Claudius, isn't it really obvious? No, wrong answer. Of course, it's Shakespeare. It's the author of the play. And what is the word? Purposes mistook, that things that fell on their heads. The sky collapsed on their heads. No, not at all. Shakespeare's in his glory as he's writing the play, and is glorified, as it were, by the play, unless you're T.S. Eliot, or you follow T.S. Eliot's judgment that it's a lousy play, that it's an artistic failure. Coriolanus was, I'd forgotten it before in my Keeping Open Secrets video, but it is Shakespeare's tragedy Coriolanus that Eliot rated much more highly, rather eccentrically to be sure, rated much more highly than Hamlet. The absence of a coherent and unifying main plot produces a series of events that are not clearly organized by causal connections. However, these episodic rather than plot-driven events of the play are nonetheless shaped, once again, into a static design. We notice in a general way that Shakespeare creates this effect by using the mousetrap, the play within the play, which he places at the precise midpoint of Hamlet and uses it as a kind of hinge, a hinge for the diptych which he's created, using it as the mousetrap which he places at the precise, of which he creates a kind of hinge that holds together the diptych. The first consisting of events leading up to this midpoint, which I've said this before, what we see is Hamlet's failure to revenge his father's death, and then following it, the shift to Claudius's failure to defend himself. It would be an act of self-defense, indeed, and a necessary act of self-defense, one would think, if he wants to survive, because he knows Hamlet in the play within the play, for whatever reason, tells Claudius as clearly as he could, I'm coming for you. And Claudius finally does, at that point, take action. This overall mirroring between stalled revenge in the first half of the play and stalled self-defense in the second may also be observed in the chiastic arrangement of scenes throughout the play. And as I said, and I'm going to, how long has this gone on? Is it gone 40? Almost 50 minutes? Oh my God. I'm going to stop, and again, I'll repeat I'll give you just one example. I'll repeat the offer to send you the diagram, if you'd like to see it, in which I've got every single major scene in the play, which I've in this diagram then show how it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, maybe, and then I can't repeat the alphabet backwards, but that's basically the final scene is, the initial scene is A, the final scene A, then B, C, going up like that until we, anyway, and if you're interested, if you'd like to see the diagram, I'll send it to you. Just get in touch with me via email through Washington College, or on Facebook, or even on YouTube. Someone asked me a while ago, I did something, on The Great Gatsby, called Plagiarism Unbound, Borrowing Desire in The Great Gatsby. And someone asked me to send a handout that I had, which I did, so even contacting me on YouTube would be useful. But listen, I'll end up just by pointing out the skill with which Shakespeare, the mastery with which Shakespeare has organized the principal events in Act 5 of the play. He's organized them in such a way that they repeat, but in reverse order, the events of the first act. Okay, so that, for example, in Act 5, you remember that it begins with the gravedigger scene. They're in the cemetery, and Hamlet is there with the skull of the court jester, Yorick. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. Very famous line. Okay, that's the first scene of Act 5. The last scene of Act 1 was out on the platform in the meeting between Hamlet and the ghost of his father. So skull of Yorick at the beginning of Act 5, ghost of his father, or ghost in any event, at the end of Act 1. Okay, the second scene then, still in Act 5, is with Laertes and Hamlet fighting over the corpse of Ophelia. Remember, she's buried there, and Hamlet Hamlet is disputing Laertes' claim that he is more in love with Ophelia, and which of them is the more in love. Remembering then the scene, the corresponding scene, next to the last scene in Act 1 is a scene you can do without, and a lot of directors do. It's the scene in Polonius's house in which Laertes is warning Ophelia against Hamlet. So you have that triangle again, which is present towards the end of Act 1 and returns at the beginning of Act 5. Right in the middle of Act 5, you have a conversation between Hamlet and Horatio. Remembering that now, of course, Hamlet has returned. Claudius thought he was sending him to his death in England. He doesn't. He returns, and he has a conversation in which he and Horatio are alone. Well, it now becomes very predictable, I suppose. So also in Act 1, there is a scene in which Horatio and Hamlet, it's a duet, as it were, between Hamlet and Horatio. No one else is around. The fourth of the major scenes then involves this is in Act 5, involves the duel between Hamlet and Laertes, which is performed in front of the court of Denmark. Well, remembering the second scene, so this is, here we have the next to the last scene in Act 5. Scene 2 in Act 1 is Hamlet and Laertes together, asking to be. Remember, they want to leave. Laertes wants to go off, and Hamlet wants to leave as well. Laertes' request is granted. Hamlet's not. So you have the two young men together again in both cases before the court, and then the last of them then is just to remember that at the very end of the play, Fortinbras comes on stage. He sees all the corpses there, and he talks with Horatio, and Horatio explains to him the speech I had quoted to you before. Horatio explains to him what has happened. Well, remember at the very beginning of the play, and again, a scene that I believe directors do get rid of because, as Hibbert pointed out, Shakespeare just did not have in mind, did not keep in mind the limitations of theater, so that many directors would get rid of the first scene in which Horatio is giving an explanation, is explaining to Horatio, Bernardo, and the other one, I'm forgetting his name for a moment, the two guards who are there. He's talking to them about Fortinbras, and so again, you see a very nice balancing between the two. Okay, that will be enough for now. It has gone on a little bit longer than I thought it would, but I will at some point do a part 3 on Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I think what I'll do Prufrock as the third part, and Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet as the fourth part, because I see I do go on a bit too long, and I want to keep these a little bit shorter. So part 3 of the Daedalus Complex on the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, part 4 on Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet. So again, thank you, and thank you especially. I had no idea how long I was going on, but if you have stayed with me, it's quite amazing. Your attention span is to be applauded indeed. I would like to think. Okay, so goodbye, and until next time. Bye-bye.